King Creole took his sweet time bringing my parents over, and that worked in my own favor. With the help of my little template friend, I got a scissors knife. What better weapon to kill a voodoo doll making monsters like him with? With renewed vigor, I acted quickly and headed downstairs to get Mary. She was my only real ally in this fight, so her help would be important. Although, let's just say she was more than a little skeptical. "That's the worst plan I've ever heard," she said, her face pressed against her hand as she shook it. Well, she didn't have much confidence in me, but at the same time, I didn't hear her coming up with any ideas. "Even if I agree to help you, you're going to be under his control. How are you going to go against that?" she asked me, a quizzical look plastered on her cracked face. "That's where you come in. You ambush him from behind and split his attention. I know for a fact he loses control when he stops focusing," I pointed out to her, handing her half of the scissor. She looked down at the item like it was an armed grenade, looking up to me. "Where the hell did you get this?" she asked, admiring the surprisingly sharp item, dragging her porcelain finger across it and scratching her polished skin with the item. "That template doll that sits on my counter," I said quickly, looking back up to the stairs and then to her. "Look, it's not important right now. I'll leave the basement door unlocked, and when you see Creole get close enough to the door, ambush him. It'll get me enough time to be out of his control and help you." "Please, Mary, I don't want him to hurt my parents," I begged her, grabbing her hands and squeezing them against mine. She was trembling as she looked down at the item and then up to me. "All right, yeah, okay, I'll do it," she nodded, looking around the basement and walking off in a direction, producing a scarf and pulling it tight against her hands. "I'll wrap this around his neck and fight against him as best I can," she said softly, coming over to me and handing me back the scissor. "You need to cut off his head completely this time. No half-assing it," she said, poking her finger into my chest. I nodded and wrapped my arms around her and pulled her into my chest, thanking her softly before quickly going upstairs to arrange everything else that might help us in our battle against the Voodoo King. My little friend wasn't much help, but he had done more than enough for me. I walked into the office and quickly looked around and looked at the only picture he cared about, Charles and his mama. I took it and shoved it into my suit. Quickly I made my way back to the counter and sat in agonizing silence as I waited for him to show up. It was maybe an hour or 5 later that he strolled right into the shop with my mother and father in tow. I hadn't seen my parents in who knew how long, and when they saw me standing at the counter, my mother screamed and quickly fainted in my dad's arms. Mom always was pretty squeamish. "What did you do to our son, you fucking freak?" my dad shouted, obviously having mixed up feelings about his only kid looking the way I look. Creole simply chuckled and drummed his fingers on his cane. His button eyes turned over to look at me with a more than satisfied smirk. "Travis, my boy, are you just gonna stand there? Come greet your mama and daddy," he ordered, snapping his fingers. The old familiar pull of the strings forced me over to my parents. At the very least, he let me talk. "Dad!" I managed to choke out through pent-up tears. I wanted to reach my arms out and hug him tight. My mom started coming around, and again she looked at me, reaching a shaking hand out to me. I may have been an undead puppet, but I was still their son. "Travis, my sweet baby boy," my mother whimpered, touching my painted cheeks and touching my combed hair, a forced smile on her face when she saw that. "I always knew you would look handsome if you combed your hair," she said with her loving smile. That alone was enough to break me. For once, I was thankful for the strings holding me up, because I just wanted to hold on to my parents tight and just let go. "Aw, not as much as I'd hate to break up the sweet family reunion," Creole interrupted, walking over to us and smiling as he rubbed the head of his cane with his gloved hands. "Travis here has been a very, very bad boy, and unfortunately, I do believe a punishment is in order," he hissed, raising his cane and snapping his fingers again. My body was stiff as a board, and a smile was forced upon my face as I took the offered cane and raised it above my head, and brought it down on my mother's head. With a sickening crack, she went down. I was screaming internally as my dad looked at what I had just done. I wish I could have told him the reason why I'd done it. that I wasn't in control of myself, but I just as quickly raised the cane again and brought it down on his head as well.
Good boy,
Creel hummed, wrapping his arms around me and pulling me close. He smiled and pinched my cheek playfully as he took the cane back from the limp noodles my arms had become. He looked at the item and rubbed some of the blood off the white orb head and patted me on the back.
Be a dear and start taking them to the basement,
he ordered, walking over to the basement door to unlock it. And that's when Mary burst through the door and tackled him quickly. He barely had time to react before Mary was on top of him, wrapping the scarf around his neck and pulling it tight. As I had predicted, his control over me faded, and I shook off the shock of attacking my parents and quickly pulled the scissors blade out. As Mary fought with him, I ran over and plunged the blade into his mouth. "What are you doing?" Mary shouted, still trying to contain him to the floor as I jostled for space next to her. I didn't have time to answer her, so instead I showed her, dragging the scissors across his stitched-up mouth and cutting free all of them. His jaw dropped open soon enough, and that black sludge began to leak out of his mouth. Next, I started putting the blade against his throat and started slicing as many stitches as I could, but inevitably he threw us off and stumbled to his feet, barely able to stand on his own.
Oh, you fucking done it now,
he snarled, spitting out loads of that black sludge. As he stumbled forward to us, he covered his mouth to keep that fluid inside of him and kept his other hand on the cane to keep himself up. It was clear to me now that the black sludge was somehow keeping his rotting corpse alive, so getting it out of him was the key to beating him. "Now, Charles," I said through the pants, reaching into my suit and pulling out a picture of his mother. "Did your mom ever teach you not to swear?" I asked, removing the picture from the frame and stabbing the blade through it. If I pissed him off before, I really fucking pissed him off with that stunt. He seemingly got a second wind and pounced on me, tackling me to the floor and beating me with his fists and his cane when he felt like it. He might very well have killed me if Mary hadn't stabbed him in the button eye with one of her shards. He screamed something fierce and fell off of me. His left button eye cracked in two and fell off to the floor. He looked up at her with his single remaining button and forced himself to stand back up.
"Going to kill me again, you whore?"
he asked her, reaching out for his cane and using it to push himself up. Obviously his strength was waning as the floor was starting to be coated in his black sludge. "No, Charles, I'm finally going to end this," she said, helping me back up and handing me the scarf to clean my bleeding face. I struggled to stand as well, but I finally managed and brandished my blade out like it was a knife. The Voodoo King Creole was finally about to be bested, except for the fact that we were in his shop, where he had all the power.
"It won't be that easy,"
he chuckled, which turned into a coughing fit as he covered his mouth again. I was ready for anything, until I noticed the wall of voodoo dolls was empty. I swallowed a lump in my throat as I pointed it out to Mary. We both collectively looked around and then up to the ceiling, where dozens of button eyes stared back at us. "Forgot about those," I said, having forgotten all about Creel's bodyguards. They fell on us like a pile of rats, each of them stabbing us with needles or razor blades, or even little claws that they had built in. Mary had an easier time with it. She was made of porcelain, so it was much harder to actually hurt her. Me, on the other hand, I was getting torn to shit. They slid down from my strings and just had a blast slicing me and stabbing me. Creel, meanwhile, struggled on his way towards his office, most likely to sew up the damage to himself, when the front door opened. A familiar British accent spoke out. "Don't listen to him anymore!" Olivia's mother shouted out, her face twisted in fear and determination. All the voodoo dolls suddenly stopped and looked over to the one that used to be among their ranks. Creel stared at her like he'd kill her if she said another word, but he didn't stop her. "He has hurt a lot of us and caused you to forget who you used to be. You were all people once, lied to and betrayed by him. He's the enemy of all of us," she pointed out to the limping Creel, who looked around as all the dolls turned their heads to him.
"You all got what was coming to you. You asked for something and I gave it to you,"
he declared. The voodoo dolls weren't persuaded, however. They all looked at each other and then leaped from me and Mary onto Creel. He cursed something fierce as they swarmed him and tackled him to the ground. It was like ants swarming dropped food. "Thank you," I said to Olivia's mother. She waved it off and quickly took the scissors from me and reached up to cut off my strings, only for me to stop her and point out at my unconscious parents. "Help them first, please," I said quickly. She looked at me with hesitation but quickly nodded, kneeling and pulling each of them out of the shop. "Was that part of your brilliant plan?" Mary asked after a moment. I looked over to her and chuckled, rubbing my combed hair and messing it up some, sighing happily at being able to do that. "Of course, I'm a master strategist," I declared, although our joking was short-lived when Creole's hand burst through the pile of voodoo dolls and emerged from them. He's buttoned back and his stitches fixed. I guess having dolls made out of the same items he needed to fix himself back up to attack him with wasn't the best idea. God, he was like a cockroach.
Everyone betrays me today!
He snarled, fixing his tie and storming over to us. Me and Mary backed up and pointed our makeshift weapons at him. I peeked over him to see all the voodoo dolls lifeless on the floor, and they had fought a good fight. I backed up and my foot hitting something on the floor. Looking down, a beautiful sigh met my eyes. My dad's Zippo lighter. It must have fallen out of his pocket when Olivia's mother had dragged him outside. Thank you so much for being a smoker, Dad. I reached down and lifted the lighter up, flicking it to life and tossing the burning flame over to the pile of voodoo dolls. And those babies must have been made of gasoline because they went up quicker than a forest fire.
No!
Creole screeched, staring back at me in horror as the fire began to spread further across the shop.
You fucking idiot! Have you any idea what you've just done?
He shouted at me, staring back at the growling inferno. The smoke from the voodoo dolls began to rise, but then the smoke seemingly turned at a 90-degree angle and headed down towards the basement. At the time, I had no idea what had just happened. Now, with hindsight, it was pretty clear. That smoke was the souls trapped in the voodoo dolls, and they were heading down to their bodies. "Looks like your time on Earth is finally up, Charles," Mary declared. Creole turned to her and grabbed her by the hair, pulling her out of my reach and forcing me to stay stiff against the front door as he backed up away from me.
Oh, don't think you ain't coming with me, whore!
He snarled. I watched in horror as shambling, rotting corpses started rising up from the darkness of the basement. Some had no flesh to speak of and were just bones shambling for their revenge. Creole looked back up and shoved Mary into their awaiting clutches. She was grabbed and began to be torn apart. I guess for eating their corpses, maybe. "Mary!" I shouted, horrified that my only friend was being killed right before my eyes. But she looked back with not an ounce of fear in her eyes. Instead, she smiled and nodded towards me. I think it was her way of thanking me for being with her, being her friend, and helping her escape the hellish torture. She waved goodbye to me and was shattered into a million fragment pieces, all of them shining and dropping to the floor.
This ain't over, Travis! I'll make sure you suffer for all of this!
Creole screamed as his shop was engulfed in fire and the rotting corpses of his victims came closer and closer to him, his back to them as he shoved his finger towards me.
You don't get out of this that easily!
He screamed as he was dragged from behind and dragged back towards the basement door. He kicked and screamed, his stitched up mouth breaking open once more and his sharp yellow teeth snapping at anything.
This isn't over!
He screamed one last time as the creatures pulled him down into the basement and the fire engulfed the door. Then the strings went slack and fell to the ground. I looked at them and my hands shook as they seemingly disappeared into thin air. I was free, but I didn't have time to waste. The fire was spreading fast and I needed to get out of there before I became one with the shop permanently. There was one thing I knew I could say. Braving the roaring fire, I walked over to the counter and saw that my little template friend was still sitting there. I reached out and grabbed him, shoving him into my pocket and quickly rushed out of the shop as the fire reached the ceiling. I exited and came upon Olivia's mother tending to my parents. "He's gone. So is Mary," I said sadly, looking to the floor and starting to cry. She reached out and wrapped her loving arms around me, hugging me tight as I let out all my pent-up emotions all over her. I may have been free from him, but I wasn't back to normal. I still had button eyes, pale skin, stitches across my neck, and those stupid rosy cheeks. Guess I would have expected that to change back to normal, but I guess not. Alexandra, the woman said. Alexandra, the woman said after a period of letting me cry. I looked at her confused, and she gave me a loving smile. My name, so you can stop calling me Olivia's mother. She chuckled, tussling my hair and getting a sad but genuine chuckle out of me. I guess I did never ask her own name, huh? Alexandra helped me take my parents to our house just as the fire department shoved up to fight the fire. Let's say the police were livid when they saw the burning voodoo establishment. Turns out, as told to me by Alexandra, that the police force made a deal with Creole decades ago. He keeps crime low for them and they don't investigate when anyone goes missing. A beautiful partnership. It also explains why no one ever investigated us. And why that rookie did. No one told him to not fuck around with King Creole. Arriving home with my parents, Alexandra assured me that their wounds would not be serious and that they would recover. That left me plenty of time to think about how to change myself back to normal. Don't get me wrong, immortality sounds great and all, but if it means once again being cooped up in my room for my entire life, I'd rather at least try to find a way to change back. I also had to find a way to tell my parents the entire story of what happened. Let's just say this site helped a lot in that department when they did wake up. It was a little awkward for them to see me like this at first, and I know they still try to avoid eye contact with me, but they still love me, and they are so happy to have me back in the house with them. They offered to help me in my search to reverse this, but they had been through so much already that I decided to go with it alone. Well, with the help of Alexandra and Olivia, of course, and the template. He's no normal voodoo doll. For once, he can communicate with me. Well, kinda. He leaves me little notes from time to time, giving me advices and updates. More often than not, it's that he loves me. Cute little guy is thankful I saved him. For now, I've been trying to get in contact with anyone who knows anything about voodoo and curses. Not much success, unfortunately. Just your usual nuts that shit themselves when they see me. But I'm giving it my all to try and find a way to fix myself. Now more than ever, I've been able to finally fall asleep and enjoy a good night's sleep for the first time in who knows how long. But one night I had a dream. A nightmare, really. I was back in the shop, the burnt out remains of the shop, and the only thing intact was the basement door. Reaching out to open it, I entered it and walked down the winding and twisting path. I made it down to the basement. There, I saw him, sitting in a chair waiting for me. He looked up at me with a big smile, a cup of wine in his hand, and he looked up at me. My body froze as he set a cup next to him and stood up, walking over to me and giving me a wide smile.
I told ya, it ain't over, Travis.
He chuckled, patting my cheek and suddenly growing those sharp yellow fangs, leaning in to bite me. I woke up in a cold sweat, panting hard and looking around my room, rubbing my head and shivering. I looked over to the voodoo template on my nightstand, and he knew why I was panting. He pointed to the window. I staggered over to it and looked out of it. And in the darkness, one normally couldn't see what was standing out there, but with my button eyes, I saw him standing underneath the street lamp. He tipped his top hat to me, and when the street lights flickered back on, he had disappeared. He isn't dead, but I'll make sure he is.